Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this session. I'm just going to give it one more minute because I can see there's quite a few in the waiting room. Okay, I think we'll kick off because we've only got an hour today, and I want to make the absolute most of it. Welcome and thanks for joining our Natural Capital and Land online event series. This is the first in a series of 4 online sessions covering really topical and critical issues. Before I cover some housekeeping, can I let you know that there has been a change from the advertised panel? I'm afraid Faye Gonzalez, who is a director with Savills, has sent her our apologies as she isn't able to be with us today. I know Faye was looking forward to participating, and I know we will miss her, but I'm pleased to share that James MacKessack-Leitch has very kindly stepped in to be part of the panel at the last minute. James is a policy and practice lead with the Scottish Land Commission, who will be able to offer thoughts on what the Land Commission are taking forward and the issues we see around these topics. It will be slightly different, but I'm sure it will work really well. Welcome to you all as participants, and welcome to our panel. Today we have Stephen Thompson, who is an agricultural economist with SRUC, Professor Deb Roberts, who is the Deputy CEO and Director of Science at the James Hutton Institute, Andy Wightman, who is an author and land reform campaigner, and James MacKessack-Leitch, as I said, who is the policy and practice lead with the Scottish Land Commission. In terms of housekeeping, a very big thank you before we start to my technical helpers who are in the background. Jess and Zara from the Commission are behind the scenes, making everything happen and keeping me right. So a big thanks to them in advance. Please be aware that this event is being recorded, including the chat and the comment section. The video recording may be published on our YouTube channel, so please have a read of the privacy details in the chat for more information. As always with our events, and especially as this is first in a series of 4, we are really keen to gather feedback from you as the audience on how it has worked. We will share a short survey after the event. Please do share your feedback, good, bad, indifferent, so we can work to make these sessions as useful and as formative and as uplifting and thought-provoking as possible. We only have an hour together today, so I'm going to be quite strict on format and timing. I will shortly hand over to Stephen Thompson, who will give a brief overview of the Commission's recently published Rural Land Market Insights report. I will then introduce Professor Roberts and Andy Wightman in turn, who will each reflect on what's happening in Scotland's rural land market, why, and the implications for not only who owns Scotland's land, but who is able to make decisions and who benefits from the land. We will then hear from James MacKessack-Leitch, who will be able to share a bit more on the work the Land Commission is doing in this area. We will then have just under 30 minutes for a discussion and a Q&A. I've got some questions up my sleeve, but I'm pretty sure that you all have questions too, and I'd really love to hear them. So please use the chat box to ask questions and also connect with other participants. We try and have as much, it's great to see when participants start connecting. I know we'll have a lot of questions, so I will do my best to get through as much as possible, but please do share them in the chat box. Now it's definitely time for me to stop talking and to hand over to our panel. So I'm going to hand first to Stephen Thompson. Stephen is an agricultural economist at Scotland's Rural College, SRUC, and one of the authors of the Commission's Rural Land Markets Insight report, which we recently published. He's an expert on aspects relating to agricultural policy, and he is currently focused on providing evidence and policy insights for officials and farmer-led groups as they look to evolve Scottish agricultural support. Stephen's research has focused on how COVID-19 and Brexit will impact on Scottish agriculture and the wider rural economy, and he is involved in assessing future support options in Wales. Stephen also led the second phase of research for the Scottish Government on the socio-economic and biodiversity impacts of driven grouse that brought new insights on the employment rights of gamekeepers and socio-economic impacts of alternative moorland uses. Over to you, Stephen.
Thanks very much, Sally, and welcome everybody I'd firstly like to thank the Scottish Land Commission for funding this piece of work, and particularly for James for providing a bit of oversight and guidance. And I suppose we owe a debt of gratitude to all the land agents that we interviewed, particularly for their open and candid insights into this ever-changing land market. And I suppose what we're talking about today is the first phase report, which we've done. There is a second phase, which is looking at the Register of Scotland's data alongside data that our partners in Savills and Strutton Parker have provided. And I really should point out that I'm actually peripheral to this first report and actually more embedded in the second report. And really, this is a sterling piece of work by Rob McMorran, James Glendinning and Jane Glass. And Rob should really be presenting here, but Rob has now joined the Scottish Government, which will be a great asset to their analytic team. So this piece of work was largely a desk-based review looking at the existing evidence. And actually, when you start probing into this, there's quite a lot of evidence out there from the land agency sector themselves. And then it was followed up by a series of semi-structured interviews with the agents to try and identify current trends within the market, what the buyer and seller motivations are, and actually what's happening with regards to increased demand for natural capital and afforestation. And to me, I've got a long history in land value work. So my very first project with the college 30 years ago was a look at recreation and amenity value of land, because there was concerns then that the recreation and amenity value of land was pushing things up beyond the agricultural prices, and people couldn't afford land. And here we are 30 years later talking about very similar aspects with regards to the land market. And suppose when I was going through the quotes, I particularly like the quotes within the report, and there was three that stood out as actually pointing to some of the changes that are happening in the market. And the first one is, for estates, we never used to look at the value of hill ground. Now we are almost disregarding the sporting value, but now valuing the peatland and plantability instead. The historical approach is now completely out the window. So it's changing the whole aspect of how we value land, or how estate agents are valuing land, particularly big estates and upland farmland has changed dramatically. Second one is there's been a shift of buyer profile for stock and hill farms. 10 years ago, hill farms were being bought by sheep farms. Planting wasn't viable, but subsidies and timber markets have made it viable for planting to come further down to the flatter farms, so they're able to buy them. For hill farms, the trend for forestry buyers has been seen for a few years, but in the last 18 months to 2 years, it's noticeably moving to stock and secondary arable land. So this is the idea that planting land is coming further down, and you hear this a lot in the farming press, and when you drive around the countryside in certain areas, you would specifically notice this. And then the final quote that really caught my eye as to how the market is changing is the big entry to the market has been the environmental buyer, and they are out competing other buyers and are able to crunch the numbers differently. That's not just investors. There are some wealthy individuals, but also corporates and charitable trusts, which was definitely a smaller element of the market previously. So this is this idea of institutional investors putting their money where their mouth is, and actually taking a long-term perspective on land and a long-term investment profile. And I suppose when I first started studying land values, there was a lot of institutional offloading of agricultural estates in the late 80s, early 90s, benefiting from the high land values. And that investment came during the 70s. The original investment was in the 70s when inflation was through the roof. And we're entering a period of high inflation. So it's going to be interesting to see if this investment in land is seen as a way of de-risking from inflation, as well as also investing in green land. And then I suppose if the way we've tried to put this report out is making sure that we're trying to consistently say what is the impact on the farmland market, the estate market, and the woodland market. But of course, there's inevitable crossovers between these, particularly with regards to woodland and land for planting. And the other thing, I suppose, when you're looking at what's published, is that quite often the estate agents or land agents talk about the marketed land, what has been marketed. And there's a noticeable shift in terms of a lot of transactions being non-marketed transactions, or they've been closed. They've been closed and the sale has occurred before a closing date has been offered. And that draws in probably slight concerns to me from a land community land purchase perspective, in that if it's behind closed doors, then perhaps communities can't access that. And then the second thing that's really probably behind as a concern from communities is affordability, because we're seeing drastic increases, or not drastic, very large increases in land values, which may mean that communities are particularly priced out of the market. The motivations, clearly from speaking to people, the motivations for sale, they remain roughly the same as previously, whether it's retirement, death, divorce, relocation, partnership splitting up, or people actually releasing capital, selling off plots of land or parts of their holding, or the whole holding, and benefiting from that. And I suppose the report's pretty clear that there's incredibly low turnover in the market. And I was trying to rack my brain, and I think when I was doing work in the 90s, it was about 2% turnover of land. So every 50 years you would get new land coming onto the market. And the assessment, the desk-based assessment, I talked to agents, it's roughly about 12,000 hectares of farmland coming to the market. There's only about 80 to 100 transactions a year. For estates, it's roughly about 30 transactions, about 51,000 hectares. For commercial forestry, it's about 50 sales, about 8,000 hectares. That gives us about 71,000 hectares. And if you add up all of the land in Scotland, or agricultural and forestry land, it's roughly 6.9 million hectares. That gives us a turnover of 1%. Now, the stuff that's been reported in the land agents is normally for farmland and estates, it's over 100 hectares, so roughly 40 acres, over 100 acres, so roughly 40 hectares. So it's 1 in 100 years. So land doesn't come onto the market very often. And when you've got that scarcity and you've got a demand that we're currently seeing, it's pushing prices up quite significantly. And I suppose the average farmland values, 30% rise in 21 alone. We're seeing more increased demand for small holdings from lifestyle purchasers, people getting out of the city or out of towns and villages, working from home. We're seeing farm buyers from down south. Previously in the 80s, it was people coming across from Ireland, selling up and benefiting from high Irish land values and relocating to Scotland. Now we're seeing some of that from England. We're also seeing neighbouring farmers buying up units when they come up, or parts of units when they come out, so they can expand. But increasingly, we're seeing competition from the forestry sector into the poorer quality land market, or the further up the hill. I suppose the key thing here is that agricultural land quality is no longer the principal driver of land values in Scotland. The opportunities for investment in forestation and for future ecosystem services is probably driving the market more than anything. From the estate side of thing, it was reported that nearly half of the estates purchased in 2021 were sold to corporate bodies, investment funds, charitable trusts. There's increasing interest in restoring peatlands, and the potential for carbon offset and developing carbon credits is growing quite significantly. Again, this is probably not a trend, it's probably been pretty consistent over a number of years, as it was reported about a third of those sales are to foreign or overseas purchasers. And that's really driving, and it's probably changed the emphasis of the estate market from a sporting, or certainly for upland estates, from a sporting perspective to a peatland restoration perspective. And that comes with opportunities for government to meet their climate targets, but also for communities to probably engage in different ways. From the forestry side of things, we've seen dramatic increases in forest values, the 20% growth in 2021, about £20,000 a hectare up to £30,000 a hectare if you've got second rotation forests with good quality infrastructure in place. And we're starting to see that land, or the forestry demand for forestry with high timber prices, that's driving other parts of the land market, which of course with capital gains tax rollover relief will mean that other people will invest back into land, and it's a bit of a self-perpetuating market at times. From a natural capital perspective, I suppose this is becoming an increasing driver, hence the reason for this discussion to date. Less productive farm holdings, upland peatland areas, all of these are coming under scrutiny, and they're under government scrutiny as well. So Nature Scot have got a vested interest in who owns this land, because government have got peatland restoration targets that are going to be quite challenging, and we know that currently the peatland restoration rates aren't as high as they possibly should be. Agricultural policy is going to change and be looking more to deliver for biodiversity, for climate change. So all of this is kind of linking towards that future support element. I've already mentioned that communities, the community element of it is that there could be challenges there, but the land agents were quite clear that they also think that these corporate bodies may be open to more novel ways of engaging with communities, and may have that as part of their corporate governance and their social commitments. And then the final part of the report is about transparency, and there was quite different views, I dare say, on whether or not our land market is transparent or not. I'm not going to go into any detail on that, because I'm sure Andy will comment perhaps more on that. Other than when I did work in the 90s, this sort of style of data that I could get out of the official data sets, it hasn't changed in 30 years. So we don't have that official data set that we can probably have that transparency that people might want. And I'll shut up because I've probably spoken for too long.
No, that's perfect. Thank you very much, Stephen. That was a really good introduction. And thanks to our technical helpers for popping the links to the paper in the chat as well. So if any of you haven't seen the paper and would like to download it, it's there, and also a couple of other links. And they'll keep doing this throughout the session. So I hope you find that really useful. We're now going to move to the next panel speaker and hear from Professor Deb Roberts. She is the Deputy Chief Executive and Executive Director of Science at the James Hutton Institute. She holds an honorary chair in the Business School at University of Aberdeen. Her research experience spans agricultural economics and regional science, and she's undertaken work for a wide range of funding bodies, including the European Commission, DEFRA, ESRC, the Scottish Government Forestry Commission, Scottish Natural Heritage, and the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. So over to you, Deb. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sally, and thank you to the Scottish Land Commission for inviting me onto the panel, and to Stephen and all of the researchers that produced the report, which I found really, really interesting. Having a better understanding of the changes that are taking place in the Scottish rural land market right now in the context of the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis, and all of the new markets that are emerging in terms of natural capital is vital. And I just think it's incredibly timely. The one thing I want to say at the outset, which might be blindingly obvious, but I think it is important, is that land values aren't just important for those people that are buying or trying to sell or trying to buy land. They're important for all landowners because they represent the capital asset of that landowner. And therefore they have implications in terms of the way land is used. So it's a really important report, and it's a really important thing to understand, and it's very timely. And I look forward to seeing the next half of the report soon. I wanted to just focus on 3 points. First of all, and Stephen did emphasize this a little bit, what the findings mean in terms of the way in which we analyze the land market going forward. The second point is just something I wanted to say about the distribution of natural capital and what that means in terms of the debate in terms of land ownership. I know we're focusing very much on carbon in this case, but there's lots of other types of natural capital, and I think just broadening it a little bit would be interesting, thinking about that spatial dimension. And then the third point was just about the communities and what this means in terms of communities and a just transition. So first of all, in terms of how we analyse the market, well, the land market is a notoriously difficult market, and I can't believe, Stephen, that you chose to do any work on it ever, because it is just so difficult. It's very thin, as you said. There's hardly any of it gets transacted in percentage terms. It's highly variable in quality. I think I just coincidentally, you can't quite see them, but the maps behind me show the land capability for forestry, land capability for agriculture that Hutton produces. And it's just all over the place, highly variable good. Traditionally, we used to think about its productive value in terms of forestry or agriculture. Clearly, that's now changing. And location, when we used to think about the importance of location in terms of distance to market, it's now much more in terms of these ecosystem services. So increasingly, when we're talking about the value of land, or we're thinking about land, we're thinking in catchment terms. How important, as a scientist, how important an upland farm is in terms of downstream flooding, or these really important networks and corridors of natural habitats. So these ecosystem services don't take any notice of land boundaries, the ownership boundaries. And so I think this spatial aspect is beginning to become more important. And the report really pulls that out, because it starts to show how the natural capital drivers are not really respecting those three sub-markets that the report looked at. It's crossing all three of them. Now, I always think land surveyors have an incredibly difficult job, but I think their job right now is even more difficult. And I do wonder if it's a time to perhaps rethink about the relationship between what have traditionally been identified as market segments, and maybe in doing so, break down some of those barriers which haven't been very useful in terms of how we've thought about land use and land use change. So that's just a question about how we analyse the market based on the findings. The second thing I was just going to mention was about this distribution of natural capital. So while the report focuses on carbon.
Sorry, Deb, I'm just going to interrupt you. I'm really sorry. I'm just getting a few messages that people are struggling to hear you. So can I ask you just to come a little bit closer to the mic? Is that okay? I don't know if it's a connection or your microphone. Is that all right?
Yes, I'm so sorry about that. It might be because I put my keyboard on top of my computer. Is that any better?
I can hear that a little bit better. So if you try it, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, apologies to everyone for that. I'll try and speak up a bit, and just if it goes again, just shout out. So the second point was about the distribution of natural capital. And while the report focuses on carbon and thinks about the Woodland Carbon Code and the Peatland Carbon Code, there are lots of different types of natural capital and ecosystem services which flow from that natural capital. And some colleagues at the Institute, working with some people at LSE, did some analysis of two different types of ecosystem services and related that to land ownership patterns in Scotland. And I thought their results were really interesting. So first in terms of carbon sequestration, they found, not very surprisingly, that most carbon sequestration was attributable to the largest areas, the largest holdings. But if you looked at another ecosystem service, and the one they looked at was air quality, air pollution removal, the people that had the biggest role in mitigating that particular problem were smallholders. And I guess you could relate this to lots of other different types of ecosystem services. And I think it would be useful to start thinking more about distribution of natural capital and how that intersects with the land ownership debate. And for me, this again places a great deal of emphasis on the regional land use partnerships and where we want certain types of ecosystem services to be delivered, where they're most important. So it's that spatial aspect which I think the report to me highlights as being important going on. So the third thing I just wanted to say was about the role of communities. And I know in the next talk, you're going to talk a little bit more about who owns the rights to natural capital. But it's pretty clear that communities are going to be affected by the sorts of land use change that are taking place. And it's important that we are cognizant of that and wherever possible, engage communities and try and ensure that the benefits are shared in a way which supports a just transition. And here I just wanted to rehearse a point that the report made in terms of what we can learn from the renewables, what we've just been through over the last 20 years effectively with renewables. And when that transition first started, a large proportion of the benefits were accrued by external stakeholders. Over time, we managed to change policy instruments and the distribution of benefits was changed. And I think we should go back and re-look at that transition and think about it in terms of the natural capital markets that are now emerging. So that's all really. The last thing I just wanted to say was the speed of change in the land market is very rapid. It is quite frightening, but actually we do need urgent change in land use patterns if we're going to address the crises that we're facing. So although it's quite scary, I am quite positive about what's happening. It just means that we need to think, we just need to take into account the wider impacts on society at the same time. So thank you.
Thank you, Deb. That was great, and that was much clearer towards the end. So thank you very much for shuffling forward. And that was really thought-provoking, your reflections there. We're now going to hear from Andy Wightman. Andy is a land reform campaigner, a writer, a researcher, an analyst, a commentator, a former member of Scottish Parliament, and an activist on issues of land, power, governance, democracy, and money. Over the past 20 years, he's undertaken a wide range of work on land tenure, land ownership, land reform, and more recently, community land rights, governance, and the dimensions of land relations. Andy studied forestry at Aberdeen University and has worked as an environmental scientist before becoming an author. And I know he always manages to dig deep and pose some really thought-provoking questions. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. Thanks very much indeed, Sally. And thanks very much for the invitation to speak at this panel, which comes on the back of concerns about the carbon economy and the impact on land markets. And I suppose the first thing to say is that, you know, land markets have always been unregulated. Stephen was giving some examples of his past research. They've always been subject to sudden growth, sudden declines, but long term, the trend has always been positive. And so over the past 40, 50 years, land has outperformed gilts, gold, FTSE 100, residential property, etc. So I suppose the first thing to say is there's nothing new here in principle. When I first got engaged in land campaigning 40 years ago, it was over the afforestation of the flow country in Caithness and Sutherland. And you then had the same land value increases. The policy was backed by government at great expense. And now it's all being undone at great expense. And the lack of market regulation didn't help, but it was the underlying forestry policy that was the driver for this change. And I think the second and possibly the most important contribution I want to make is that this debate cannot take place in isolation. In other words, a debate around land markets and natural capital. The impact of climate finance and land markets is important, but in my view, the debate has to be more about climate finance and climate policy more widely, because that is the driver here. So in other words, there's two policy areas, two policy issues at play here. The first is about our approach to tackling the climate crisis, which obviously is a huge policy issue with global implications. And second is the policy area of land reform. And here they obviously interact, but they are distinctive. And it's my view, and I'm always willing to change my view, of course, that we should not be having this debate because, in my view, there should not be a market for carbon credits. Government has a target, I understand, to double the carbon market by 2025, but hasn't explained why and hasn't explained what role it's designed to play in tackling the climate crisis. So Scotland has a finite capacity within broad parameters, of course, to sequester carbon. Indeed, I think there was a study done by University College London showing that even if we restored the oceans and the wetlands and the woodlands and the soils of the globe and eliminated agriculture at the same time, you would still only be talking about a sequestration potential of the planet or equivalent to 10 years of global emissions. So sequestration potential is finite. If we restore Scotland's wetlands, peatlands and woodlands to their maximum extent, and obviously that extent is subject of some debate, we will increase the sequestration of greenhouse gases, and that will go some way to tackling the climate crisis. But equally important, in fact, far more important in climate policy, is to achieve a rapid reduction in emissions. And that's the goal set out by the IPCC in its most recent report, arguing that emissions, in fact, should peak by 2025 and decline rapidly thereafter. And the problem, as I see it, is that every ton of carbon sequestered in Scotland by ecosystems and sold as a carbon credit is a ton of carbon that's doing nothing to tackle climate change. Yet we seem to be sleepwalking into selling off our sequestration potential in an unregulated voluntary market to wealthy individual investors and corporations, to enrich them, to enrich the various intermediary bodies and professionals, and to actively reduce our potential to make a net contribution to cooling the planet. And I think this is mad. And the impacts on the land market, therefore, are merely the symptoms of a dysfunctional climate policy in relationship to natural capital. Symptoms, unfortunately, that are exacerbating land inequalities. But if land reform is to achieve anything, it's land reform that should be tackling those inequalities. And you do this through market regulation, you do it through fiscal policy. But over 90% of Scotland's land is still zero rated for non-domestic rates, for example. The small business bonus scheme is paid to some of the wealthiest people on the planet because their valuations are so low. And so this land market research is very useful and very interesting, but you'd have had the same results 10 or 20 years ago. And so the policy questions I think we need to be addressing are, first of all, what is the role of sequestration, carbon sinks, carbon finance in tackling the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis? And secondly, how for land reform objectives should we regulate markets to ensure the fair, democratic, equitable and just allocation of land rights? And of course, that's a long standing question. And we have to be very, very careful of not seeking to amend land reform policy in response to a very particular and a very focused and indeed a very sudden change in the way that land markets work in response to carbon. And to conclude, I think arguably the most effective way of achieving this reform, in fact, in relation to sequestration and carbon rights, is to convert the atmosphere to a commons regime rather than part of private property rights. But given that we've never really, in 20 years of devolution, had a fundamental reform of land tenure beyond abolishing feudal tenure, that may be a fond hope. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andy. That was great. And I knew you would pose some really thought-provoking questions, as all of our panel so far has. I'm going to pass now to James. So James MacKessack-Leitch comes from an arable family farming background in Moray and has a range of experience in the private and public sectors as well as with voluntary organisations, not least as a former director and vice chair of the Forest Area Community Trust. As one of our policy and practice leads, James contributes to the Commission's work on land governance, land and human rights, land access for agriculture and common good land and assets. So I just want to ask James if he can just reflect a little bit on the Commission's work and the issues as we see it. And I think it links to quite a lot of what the panel have brought up there.
Yep, thanks, Sally. So I think the first place I'll start is just a reflection on how the Land Commission got to where we got to. So last year, last summer in particular, there were a number of high-profile purchases of land by new landowners, and there was an increasing media interest, political interest, lots of interest in what was actually going on. And that obviously poses the question of, well, who's going to find out what's going on? So that was something that we picked up and decided to actually try and find out what's really going on, get behind the green laird's hype, and really discover how the land market is functioning and what the changes brought about by the climate emergency in particular, but also the other motivations and activities that are happening in the land market are contributing to any sort of change. And I think what we found with the report that we have published so far is that there's a lot more going on in the land market than perhaps people thought, and certainly more than the headlines perhaps suggested there was. And as Stephen has kind of really ably outlined, yes, there's a lot of interconnections, but really there's a lot of different things going on. And in things like the commercial forestry market, it's a lot of the usual suspects who have just hit on a vein of high timber prices, very beneficial government support, and it's purely them taking their businesses to the next level. On the other hand, we do have a load of new buyers, new people with new motivations, and that really is causing some interesting scenarios and posing quite a lot of difficulty for those of us that work in the land sector, because we are moving away from some of the traditional ways of valuing and using land. We are moving away from sporting, fishing, lots of the agricultural values, towards new values that are perhaps harder to define, because the owners and the prospective owners that are coming into the land market are also new. They're not the sort of people who were in the land market previously, insurers and brewers and other corporate institutions and NGOs. So it's a mixed picture, and there's a lot of challenges for us to address. But fundamentally, for the Land Commission, we're I suppose what we consider land use agnostic, in a way that it actually doesn't matter to us per se what the land use is. It's about the rules of the game, about how communities are engaged, how the market functions, how accessible it is, how transparent it is. And those are the sorts of issues that don't change, whether it's people buying land for carbon sequestration or for agriculture or for forestry. Those rules don't change. And looking towards kind of some of the other areas, and one of the things that Andy touched on that the Commission is definitely kind of looking more into, is around that area of policy alignment. There are so many different public bodies involved in land in different aspects. There are so many private sector industries, interests and communities who all have different aspirations for Scotland's land. And it's an ability to try and join some of those up together and avoid some of the unintended consequences that is really the focus for the Commission going forward. But again, one of the things that's quite interesting about this area of work is that the issues that come up through the research are very much the same issues that the Land Commission has spotted before in our previous work on scale and concentration. It is about power imbalance. It is about transparency and accessibility. And some of these issues, again, it doesn't really matter what the land use is or what the landowner's motivations are. It's about the rules of the game and ensuring that that game is fair for everyone and that everyone has a fair chance to play. So I think the key message for us is it comes out in two main things. It's around that policy alignment, ensuring that there is better public sector leadership, that we really understand what is going on, and improving our ways of collecting evidence as much as anything to really make that judgment and to refine our policy. But also looking at some of the areas that we've worked on before, and going back to many of our recommendations around scale and concentration, so things like a public interest test, improvement in land rights and responsibilities, good practice on the ground, and a lot of those things that we've touched on before. So I would suggest that actually, in one sense, while a lot of this is new and exciting and interesting, a lot of it is also the same old things around power and control. And I think that's where the Land Commission can play a really consistent role in saying it doesn't really matter what you're using your land for. It's about the rules of the game and about how we ensure that everyone gets a fair chance to participate and make their voices heard, and that actually Scotland's land works for the entirety of Scotland's population.
Thanks, James. That was great. And I wanted to come back to the panel, actually. So, you know, you've made the point that things haven't, you know, many things are the same as they were 20, 30 years ago. But in another way, this is a very timely and a sudden change to the land market. So I want to ask, and I think I'll let all of you answer this. So if I come to you first, Stephen, do you think that the term natural capital is a helpful term in allowing us to understand what is happening in the land market?
I'm always less concerned about terms rather than what's happening on the ground. And I suppose it's probably as good a term as anything as to what's actually happening, simply because we are seeing people speculating, I think, speculating as to what the future markets may well be in this natural capital sphere of ecosystem services, whatever you like to call it. And you're definitely seeing that probably in the uplands with regards to people realizing that they can get access to quite healthy government support for peatland restoration, for example. So the government have committed £250 million over 10 years to peatland restoration. It's a highly concentrated area where we've got peatlands. So you've got Keith's work at Keith Matthews' work at, and his team's work at the James Hutton shows that it's really, really concentrated. You're talking about 300 owners have got the vast majority of our deep peat reserves. So where's that money going to go? It's the same with renewable energy. It goes to it self-perpetuates land ownership scale. It goes to the already wealthy, those with access to that land. So this whole market space, there's an awful lot going on within it. And again, forestry, there's access to government monies. And on one hand, we've got a government that want land reform, yet on the other hand, we've got all of the support monies going into these landowners, which is not means tested perhaps because they're delivering public goods. And that's where we have to get. And I'm in agreement with Andy, as if we truly want land reform and restrict some of this, then fiscal measures are what's required. But we don't seem to ever want to discuss tax breaks on land and forestry, etc. I don't think I've answered your question. But
no, that's okay. Thanks, Stephen. I'm going to come to Deb now, because actually you mentioned about how you think it's going to be wider and it's going to bring in more ecosystem services. And I'm actually going to say a big thank you to Dominic, who has helped me make my question better by adding on the tag of what would be better if you don't like that natural capital as a term or helpful, what might be better. So
Deb, you're on mute.
Can you hear me?
Very quietly.
Sorry, I'm on mute now, so if you can come as close to the mic as possible, you're very quiet.
Okay. Is that any better?
A little bit. Well, that's better there now.
I like the term natural capital, actually. I don't have a problem with it whatsoever. And I think the reason I like it is because it is consistent with the two crises that I think are driving the changes in the land market. And I think the changes in the land market are quite radical. I disagree that it's the same old, same old. I think these are new things which are driving change, and they are to do with the biodiversity crisis, which links to natural capital, and they are to do with the drive to net zero, which requires carbon sequestration. So actually, I like the term, and I hope that it would help us. I go back to that point about, I think this term is going to make us look at the land market in a different way, away from the old agriculture, forestry, bilateral way of looking at it, estates, farmland, into a more sort of generic, what have we got in Scotland? We've got very rich natural capital. Let's understand our land market in that context, in terms of the ecosystem services that it's delivering. So personally, I think it is a useful term, and it's really useful for understanding the changes that are happening right now.
Thank you. And I'll pass the same question to Andy, or if you have any reflections, Andy, on that.
Very briefly, I mean, I agree with Deb that natural capital is a useful conceptual term. It has been for some time in ecosystem services. The problem with it, however, is that because of the word capital, because of the word ecosystem services, the problem is what Stephen's identified, is this has given, provided a framework within which those who own those rights to basically demand of policymakers that they be paid for the delivery of those services. Now, I think the delivery of a lot of those services, clean water, healthy peatlands, healthy woodlands, etc., should be an obligation in the tenure system. It shouldn't be something we pay people for. It should be a consequence of the responsibilities and the privileges that come with the ownership of land. So that's the big problem I see with it, and I don't really see much changing in that regard.
Okay, thank you. James, would you like to come in on that?
I can do briefly. Yep. I think for me, I mean, natural capital again is a useful term. I think perhaps where it gets slightly frustrating is where it's used as shorthand for carbon sequestration, and that does seem to happen quite a bit. But one of the things that I would like to kind of point out when I'm trying to explain this to people is, if you have two identical forestry plantations and one is long-term carbon sequestration is never going to be felled, but the other one is going to be felled, yet they're identical in every other way. What is the actual real difference on the landscape and everything else? You're still exploiting, if you like, the country's natural capital, its ability, the land's ability to produce timber. It's the land use at the end of the day, the use to which we as society are putting it, that is different. So in actual fact, I would consider, you know, things like agriculture and commercial forestry very much a part of exploiting that natural capital. And I think that's where, as Andy points out, you start to get into the issues of, well, then it's all about monetizing, it's about money and finance, and therefore people should be paid to utilize their capital in a productive way, or the way that the government of the day suggests it should be.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I'm going to turn now to the chat box and try and get a couple of these questions coming in. And thanks very much to the audience for posing them. There's some really good questions here. And I think I'm going to maybe pass this first one to Deb to have a think about. So, with land use being changed to forestry for investment or to improve companies' green credentials, should there be a separate planning category for forestry to ensure good food production land remains in that use? Now, that's quite a kind of specific question, so feel free to go a little bit wider.
So, yeah, I'm sorry, I hope I've got the question. I think the question was, is it okay for land use transition to occur for good prime agricultural land to be converted to forestry? Is that the essential question?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that this is one of the most, this is obviously a huge bone of contention between different land use sectors at the moment, and it's very problematic. I think what the report showed was actually it tended to be the much poorer agricultural land that was getting bought up. I mean, Stephen, correct me if I'm wrong in this, but it did seem to be more of the upland farms, the poorer agricultural quality land that was shifting. It wasn't the high quality agricultural land that was shifting. And the types of changes that are happening on the higher quality agricultural land tended to be in the margins, again, in the poorer, perhaps the smaller pockets of poorer quality land in those areas. So the market is kind of working in that respect. There was a lot of debate in the report, or commentary in the report, about how off-market sales were occurring because of potentially because farmers that were selling out to afforestation didn't like, there was some sort of social stigma with the fact they were doing that. And I found that actual commentary within the report really interesting, and it's a very important sort of cultural barrier that I think, again, it would be really useful to understand a little bit better. So in terms of whether or not it should happen, or the extent to which it's happening, it would be useful to know from Stephen if I'm right, that it actually, that is less of a problem than perhaps it is the discourse is suggesting. I know it's a very strong worry of the agricultural sector, but I'm not quite sure how much it's happening. So I'm going to throw it to Stephen, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for adding into the chat as well, Stephen. So please come in there.
Yeah, I mean, so I was down in Dumfries or Newton Stewart talking to farmers recently, and it always comes up in conversation. And it wasn't until I actually drove, as a road I'd never come through, is through New Galloway and all the way up to Edinburgh through that way. And I was actually taken aback with the amount of land that was now planted with relatively new planting. And you hear from, it's actually probably dairy land, that it's happening, good quality dairy grazing land in parts of Ayrshire where I'm hearing sort of all of the farms that are coming onto the market seem to be going into the forestry sector, less so in the arable side of things. I think the arable side of things, there's relatively little of it going into afforestation. Is it going to impact on food security or all of these issues? I don't know, given that we export a lot of our grazing livestock to either rest of the UK or exported into Europe or beyond. It's always this debate that seems to be had, and there's a heck of a tension within the farming industry with regards to forestry. And I think part of that is this continual loop that once it's forested once, it has to be replanted and replanted. And they think that it'll never ever come back into agriculture. Yet there's been years and years of effort to try and make it into productive land. So I think you're quite right, Deb. It's probably more marginal land where it's probably livestock. And remember, we've lost a heck of a lot of sheep off the uplands. And I think that's probably forgotten in much of this debate. We have lost an awful lot of sheep from these areas. So the activity is not as big as it was.
Thanks, Stephen. That's really interesting. And I personally always like it when we consider the changes in that kind of wider context. And we've had another question here, and I want to pose this to Andy. And again, I'd like you to think like wider, if you wish. So with hearing about these questions we've had there on the kind of the food crisis, there's obviously climate change, we've got the biodiversity, and it's obviously a lot of competing things. So what do you think needs to be done for the land market to help us meet our climate objectives on one hand, but also these other crises? And then there's all the local needs of housing and so on and so forth. You know, what's your what would be your vision?
Well, I don't think the land market can be relied upon to deliver any public policy objectives, because the land market is essentially unregulated. So you've got a choice. You either regulate the land market to better align with public policy objectives, or you place greater responsibilities within the tenure system, which in effect is what the Land and Rights and Responsibilities is trying to do, but it's voluntary, and so it should be within the tenure system. It should be people's obligations and duties to maintain ecosystems in a good state of health. But that's the situation actually in many uplands across continental Europe. It's a criminal offence, for example, to damage some ecosystems because of the public goods they deliver in terms of clean water, avalanche protection, and all the rest of it. And I noticed that Andrew Heald talks about in the chat about importing timber. We need much, much more timber. Absolutely. Timber and indeed fast-growing plantations are extremely good at absorbing carbon. And that's quite a bad idea to plant trees and just leave them and not clear fell them. Far better to fell them and convert them into sawn timber, which is then used in construction and locked up, hopefully for another 60 or 80 years in the fabric of a building. So the bottom line is we need much, much clearer public policy on what land is for. And then the various strands of public policy, planning, regulation, fiscal policy, land reform, should be aligned to delivering those. And that's not what we're doing. We've got some grand visions and grand statements by government about targets and various things, and then we just leave it up to a completely unregulated global market to try and hopefully deliver them.
Thank you. And I want to say a big thanks to the conversation in the chat. I found that really interesting, and it's been really good to see everybody who's in the chat getting involved. I know we've got a really big audience today, and I know we've had more questions, and I know that this is just the beginning of our series and just the beginning of our conversation. And I want to just ask James to come in just very, very briefly to just tell you a little bit about what's coming up over the next couple of months on this from the Land Commission.
Thanks, Sally. Yes, so as mentioned earlier, so the report that we're largely focused on today was a phase 1 report and the Land Market Insights report. The second, which is more kind of crunchy data report that Stephen's done an awful lot of work on, and that will be published in the next few weeks. We have more of these events as well, public events. So there's another one next week, which will be absolutely fascinating as well. So I would encourage you, if you haven't signed up for that yet, to come along to that as well. And towards the end of June, we will be looking to publish some advice to ministers, essentially on what we've discovered on the land market, potentially some of the interventions. We're doing an extensive kind of phase of stakeholder engagement at the moment. But this first phase of our work on natural capital should be wrapping up towards the end of June. Once we get to that point, we'll see what comes next in terms of potential interventions, more research, who knows what. It's all developing incredibly quickly. So, but watch this space because there's a lot more to come.
Thanks, James. And as James said, this is developing incredibly quickly. So I'd just like to take this opportunity personally to thank our staff for all the work they're doing and being really adaptable and really flexible to help us do this really vital work at this time. And I'd like to take this opportunity just to thank the panel. It's been absolutely excellent. So thanks to Stephen, Andy, Deb and James. I think it's been a really, really interesting discussion, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and I hope others have. And I know this is just the beginning of these conversations, and I know we could have carried on today for many more hours, but thank you all very much. Thanks to everyone who came along to join us today. It's been fantastic to see such high numbers. It's been fantastic to see such a wide variety of participants and so many people coming together to hear and discuss these topics. Thank you so much to the technical experts behind the scene who've been keeping me right. And please, please, please do fill in our survey so that we can make sure we make these sessions as useful and beneficial to all. So thanks again to the panel. Thanks to you all. Safe home, and see you all soon for more things like this.